Good morning. It's good to be with you again. I'm my daughter Diane and her husband Jim, and we're at the Maverick RV Park at Lajitas, Texas, which is right outside the border of Big Bend National Park and also contiguous to Big Bend Ranch State Park, and both are enormous parks. The weather, it's October, you'd think it'd be cooler during the day, but at night it gets down to the high 50s, but during the day it gets up to 100 still out here on the desert. I want to talk a little bit today about with a quote from Matthew about being a good steward in God's kingdom. That doesn't mean just giving money. That means the work you do and that you do for others. The gospel today that I'm going to talk about is Matthew 22:34-40. And since I'm celebrating my 50th year as a lawyer, I'm talking about this reading's about a Pharisee who's also a lawyer. Pharisees were legal eagles for the Jewish law. A Pharisee who was a lawyer asked Jesus. He wanted to test him. Lawyers tend to do that. He said, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" Jesus answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So that's the instructions Jesus gives to be a good steward of God's kingdom. That's his commandment. Now in Deuteronomy, these quotes were taken from Jesus, were taken from the Old Testament, and where God instructs the people of God to be protectors of the legally defenseless, the resident alien, orphan, widow, and the poor. These stewardship duties were set out to the people of God, the Hebrew nation, over 3,000 years ago. Now today we have tax-supported and charitable institutions that provide many of these services, such as charity hospitals, Social Security disability, and other programs. So is there still a place for us, the Christian community, the church, to be useful stewards in today's world? Well, I met a guy who was actually even older than me in the church I worked at for a while up in Nevada City, California. His name was Fred Hargesheimer. Now Fred joined the Army Air Corps right before World War II broke out. So by the time the war broke out, he was already an experienced Army Air Corps pilot, and he was stationed around the Philippines in New Guinea. So that was 78 years ago that Fred Hargesheimer, who was a very fine Episcopalian and then a young World War II military fighter pilot, he crashed in the jungles of New Guinea. After 3 weeks, he crashed near a river, but he was starving, and he had been drinking the water out of the river, and he was dying of malaria. So he was laying helpless on the bank of the river. The Japanese, who then occupied New Guinea, hadn't found him. But some local natives found him and took him to their village. When he came to, he heard drums. There was a big fire, and there was a huge pot on the fire. And he thought that he was going to be the next meal. But then he heard some singing. And they were singing, "Onward, Christian Soldiers." They had seen the cross he wore around his neck, and they knew he was a Christian. And they were singing Christian songs that they had learned from a missionary who had converted the whole tribe years before. The tribe worked together as stewards of God's kingdom to protect Fred Hargesheimer from the Japanese soldiers. They fed him. At first he couldn't even eat. He was so weak. So he had to drink mother's milk. Now these natives nurtured him back to health. When the Japanese soldiers came around looking for him, they hit him effectively. Now these natives had nothing in common with Fred, except they were Christians. And they knew that song, "Onward, Christian Soldiers." And they were following those 3,000-year-old rules of stewardship from Exodus. And they were also following the 2,000-year-old demands of Jesus for stewardship. To love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. These New Guinea natives risked their lives to help him. They knew what the Japanese soldiers were like, but they gladly shared with him and risked their lives for him. Now that command to love God with all your being was taken from Deuteronomy 6:5 and was recited by all Jews at least twice a day. It was called the Shema, S-H-E-M-A. But Jesus threw a wild card into the Shema. He combined it with Leviticus 19, verse 18, which commands us to love our neighbors as ourselves. The sticking point for Jesus was, who was your neighbor? For righteous Jews, and for that Pharisee who was questioning Jesus, your neighbor was another Jew, and the Gentiles were outside of that realm. But Jesus says everything we do must meet that test. In fact, says Jesus, the entire Jewish Old Testament, especially the Torah, the law, hangs upon this test. So Jesus put the Shema, loving God, into the here and now of loving your neighbor. So stewardship, as defined by Jesus, is more than just loving God now for some future action. Stewardship in God's kingdom is right now, in the turmoil of loving your neighbor. who may not seem very lovable. Martin Luther said, "A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none." And then he says, "A Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all." Well, Fred Hargesheimer was taken in a canoe out into the ocean. The natives had made contact with the spy from Australia who was living in the jungle, and they had contact with him, and he would give information to the American military and the Air Corps as to the movements of the Japanese on New Guinea. He made contact at a submarine, met the native canoe with Fred in it out in the ocean. They paddled all the way down the river, evading the Japanese soldiers. And when he got better, he went back to duty and finished the war as a pilot for the United States Army Air Corps. Now, Fred had been raised in a very conservative household, and he was a good Christian man, but this changed him to the point that after he got to the point where he could take off for a whole year from his job with the 3M company. He was an engineer, and his children had been raised and had finished college. He and his wife raised thousands of dollars and went back to New Guinea and stayed for over a year, helping them build a school for their kids. And the granddaughter of the lady that helped keep him alive with the mother's milk was a student at that school. And she went on to be the first native of New Guinea from that area of New Guinea to get a college degree. And she ran the entire education system for a while for New Guinea. Love of neighbor was demonstrated and repaid by Fred and his wife. Thanks be to God.